Okay, guys, this will be your AP Euro notes for Tuesday, May 5th, Cinco de Mayo. We're talking about social and cultural developments in the late 1800s. Look at religion first. Religious beliefs and institutions made a significant recovery in the period after 1815, particularly considering the extent of the challenges posed to organized religion by the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic era. Secular rulers saw religion as an important bulwark for the existing social order, with the revolutions of 1848 further spurring this trend towards the state-supported religion. Catholicism. Spain in 1851 declared Catholicism the only religion of the Spanish people, while in Austria the reforms that Joseph II had imposed on the Catholic Church in the late 18th century over areas such as the training of priests were repealed. Nowhere were the events of 1848 felt more than in Rome, where a revolution forced Pius IX to flee his city. Restored to power with the help of the French troops, he issued the encyclical Syllabus of Errors, which listed liberalism as one of the errors of modern life. In 1870, Pius put forward the doctrine of papal infallibility, which posits that when making an official statement on matters of faith, the Pope could not be in error, a controversial doctrine that alarmed moderate Catholics. Perhaps inevitably, there was a backlash against religious institutions where they appear to be standing in the way of change. Such criticism could be clearly expected from liberal circles, but even conservative politicians could be antagonistic towards religious bodies. In the newly unified Germany, Bismarck saw Catholicism as a force that could rip the nation apart because Catholics were tied to the supranational institution that would be the object of their primary loyalties. To deal with this perpetuated threat, Bismarck, with the support of German liberals, attacked Catholic institutions in what was known as the Kulturkampf, a cultural war, taking control over Catholic schools and appointment of bishops. After seeing that this was having little effect, Bismarck stopped the harassment in 1878. In the last quarter of the 19th century, there was a growing sentiment among Catholic and Protestant clergy that religion needed to address the social issues of the day. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII issued Rerum Novarum of New Things, and although the encyclical reaffirmed the right of private property and bashed socialism, it said that Christians in general and the church specifically had a responsibility towards the poor. In primarily Catholic countries such as France and Italy, this message led to the establishment of the Catholic social movement, while in Protestant lands, churches expanded their efforts on behalf of the poor. The Bible of History. In the German states of the 19th century, a group of theologians began to study the Bible as history in search of the historical Jesus. A critical step in this effort was the publication in 1835 of the life of Jesus Christ, critically examined by David Frederick Strauss. For Strauss, the Bible consisted of a series of myths formulated by the early Christians, ultimately providing for a scripture that contained, in a famous phrase, a Christ of faith rather than the Jesus of history. The work of these German theologians was brought to England by Samuel Taylor Coleridge as well as George Eliot, who translated Strauss's life as well as the Ludwig Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity, which argued that God was a man-made device that reflected our own inner sense of the divine. Religion for working class and peasants. In Great Britain, a religious census taken in 1851 revealed the attendance in church was much lower than expected and that the working class in particular had very little connection with organized religion. On the other hand, the 19th century was not without some interesting examples of continuing strength of popular religious sentiment. One well-known incident dates back to 1858 when a young French peasant girl named Bernadette saw a vision of Virgin Mary, an event that was repeated 18 more times. The waters from the Grotto of Lourdes where she saw the vision became an important religious shrine. Judaism, anti-Semitism, and Zionism. For Jews, the 19th century presented new opportunities as well as new pressures. The legal status of Jews improved throughout the century. In 1858, Jews were allowed to enter the House of Commons in Great Britain, and in the following decade, Jews received full political rights in Austria-Hungary and Germany. Despite their newly enhanced legal status, social discrimination remained endemic. Those Jews who wanted to rise in certain professions or in government often found the path blocked to them unless they converted. The last quarter of the 19th century was a period of increasing hardships for Jews. For many, Jews were seen as responsible for new and troubling trends in modern economic life, such as the creation of the department store, which put small shopkeepers out of business. The economic depression of 1873, which lasted for most of the remainder of the decade, led to an increase in prejudice. Economic resentment was combined with a new form of anti-Semitism. The word was first used in 1879 based on social Darwinist notions of Jews as being part of the distinct and foreign race and not just members of religious domination. Hitler's early years in Vienna were spent in a city governed by Karl Lueger, who was elected mayor of the city on an openly anti-Semitic platform. Anti-Semitic political parties formed in Germany, while in France, the Dreyfus Affair helped give rise to Action Francois, or Francaise, a monarchist group that was virtually anti-Semitic. It doesn't say much about Dreyfus Affair, but remember that was the whole scandal in France where they tried to make this Jewish captain look like he did something wrong and went to jail and eventually proved that he was innocent. In Russia, the monarchy used attacks on Jews, or pogroms, as a tool for redirecting popular anger, which might otherwise have been directed towards the throne. Several million Jews left Russia at the turn of the century to escape the persecution that grew worse after the 1905 revolution. For many Jews, the optimism they felt at the end of the century that the future would bring even greater social acceptance was by the end of the century being destroyed by a wave of hatred. For some, this would lead to the conclusion that the only hope to live in peace would be through the establishment of Jewish homeland. The leading advocate of Zionism, as the idea was called, was Theodor Herzl, an Austrian journalist who was horrified over the anti-Semitism that bubbled over the surface as a result of the Dreyfus Affair. In the Jewish state, he argued that Jews must have a state of their own and began to form a worldwide organization to achieve this goal, with the first Zionist Congress meeting in Switzerland in 1897. The rights and role of women. The role of the family changed in the 19th century, with one of the most significant developments being the families. That families, which at one time operated as a cohesive economic unit, no longer function in such a manner. Increasingly, there were now separate spheres for both male and female endeavors, with the male going off to earn the money that provided for the family support. In the late 19th century, the rise of sizable wealthy middle class created new gender standards. Middle-class city dwellers had the money and energy to record their social views and set standards for the taste for their nations. And among those families who had the money, the new standard was for a man's place to be in the workforce and a woman's to be in the home, which was increasingly seen as a haven in an increasingly ever-changing world. This idealism of the household and the female's place was within it led to the Victorian period of the rise of what's known as cult of domesticity. Among the well-off, women were expected to exhibit certain traits that were to make the home a blissful paradise. Submissiveness was one of the traits that women were expected to exhibit, along with sexual purity and religious piety, because women were expected to be responsible for religious life of the family. Books were written to provide women with tips on running the households and raising their children. Standards were quite different for the poor majority of the country. Working-class women worked just as hard as working-class men, whether in factories or in forms of domestic labor, such as taking in laundry or as servants. Many worked multiple jobs and had little time and energy left to raise children, let alone read books on the subject. The working class would, nevertheless, sometimes receive visits from well-meaning but patronizing middle-class women offering to instruct them in news wave home economics. Limits to women's education. Keeping women in the home was in part ensured by outside institutions that limited the opportunities that were available to females. Higher education was generally reserved for men, although cracks began to appear, with women being allowed to attend the University of Zurich in 1865 and the University of London in 1878. With the development of professional societies in areas such as medicine and law, women found an additional barrier, as the bylaws of these societies generally excluded women. For those middle-class women who did not work outside the home, certain professions, such as primary school teacher, nurse, secretary, and librarian, became almost completely female, which also ensured that they were poorly paid jobs in comparison to those held by men. Some women were able to move beyond the bounds of convention. Frances Power Cobb was one of the first women to make a living as a journalist and later became an active campaigner against medical vivisection, and Josephine Butler challenged the basic Victorian prohibition simply by talking about sex publicly. Butler helped fund the Ladies' National Association in 1869, an all-female organization that was fought against the Contagious Diseases Act, which allowed for women who were deemed to possibly be infected by sexual transmitted diseases to be dragged off the street for examination while males went unaccosted. Women's struggles for increased rights. As the century continued, a growing number of women began to criticize the civil disabilities under which they live, such as the lack of right to divorce or possess property rights. These women, who adopted the French word feminist to describe themselves, began to organize organizations to help bring about change. Even in unexpected places, such as in a conservative society like Greece, a feminist newspaper existed that advocated for professional and civil rights and survived for more than 20 years with a circulation of 20,000. We'll stop video.